This is Lecture 6 in the series Essentials of Capitalism. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On the basis of what we saw yesterday about the nature of economic inequality in a capitalist society, we are now in a position to grasp the enormity of the injustice that Marxism and its followers have perpetrated in connection with this subject. According to Marxism, the inequality between capitalist and worker is essentially no different than the inequality that prevailed in earlier periods. All of history, declares Marxism, is the record of one continuous class struggle that has been carried on in different forms and different guises. In the ancient world, it was between master and slave. In the Middle Ages, between lord and serf. Today, it is between capitalist and worker. The worker of capitalism, says Marxism, is also a slave, a wage slave, and the capitalist is an exploiter, even more ruthless than the feudal lord or ancient slave owner. For capitalism, says Marxism, quote, cannot even maintain its slaves in their slavery, unquote, but compels them to sink ever deeper into poverty and starvation. Mankind's only salvation from exploitation and class conflict, its only hope for elevation into a new world of peace and harmony, Marxism declares, is the establishment of socialism. Socialism, it claims, holds out the promise of a classless society, free of all exploitation and conflict, a society of perfect equality. In achieving the equality of wealth and income, it will allegedly complete the work of the so-called bourgeois revolutions of the 18th and early 19th centuries that established representative government and political equality. All of this is the standard line that permeates the contemporary educational system, in history books, in so-called social science courses, and in practically every nook and cranny into which it is possible to smuggle it. Every aspect of the Marxian doctrine on inequality is false and malicious. It claims to see as essential the mere existence of inequalities in wealth and income, absolutely irrespective of their nature and cause. It ignores the radical day and night difference between economic inequality under capitalism and economic inequality under serfdom and slavery. Specifically, what it ignores is the fact that under capitalism, economic inequality rests on differences in productive contribution, which contributions operate to the benefit of all. Those who have more under capitalism have it because they contribute more to production, or because their parents or grandparents did, and their contributions enabled everyone else to have more also. In other words, the greater wealth and income of the capitalists and of the higher paid wage and salary earners is earned, and the process of earning it is the source of general benefits. The greater wealth and income of a feudal lord or of a slave owner, on the other hand, was of an entirely opposite character. It was obtained not by means of any productive contribution on his part, but by means of physical force, essentially by theft and extortion. As such, his gain really was the loss of others. What a robber steals, his victim loses. The Marxists seek to evade having to acknowledge the difference between a capitalist and the owner of serfs or slaves by means of an equivocation on the use of the word force. The owner of serfs or slaves obviously uses force or the threat of force against them. But, say the Marxists, isn't the fact that reality compels a man to work if he would eat not also a kind of force? And isn't it force that for all practical purposes a worker must work for a capitalist unless he is in the exceptional position of having a fairly substantial amount of savings of his own? Thus, aren't the workers forced, after all, to work for the capitalists? Such ideas are expressed in a more subtle form by John Kenneth Galbraith in his book, The New Industrial State. He writes, quote, the worker in a Calcutta jute mill who loses his job, like his American counterpart during the Great Depression, has no high prospect of ever finding another. He has no savings, nor does he have unemployment insurance. The alternative to his present employment, accordingly, is slow but definite starvation. So though nominally a free worker, he is compelled. The fate of a defecting Southern slave before the Civil War or a serf before Alexander II was not appreciably more painful. The choice between hunger and flogging may well be a matter of taste." End quote. The essential point Galbraith seeks to make in this passage is that the distinction between freedom and slavery is nominal if a worker must work in order to avoid starvation. This idea is vicious. It is straight out of 1984. It claims literally that freedom is slavery. It is a repetition of the apologetics for slavery offered in the South before the Civil War, and today by the supporters of Soviet Russia. The difference between freedom and slavery is as sharp as day and night, even when a worker must work to avoid the pain of hunger. For it is not the capitalist employer who causes the worker's hunger. On the contrary, he provides the means of overcoming the worker's hunger. The worker works for the capitalist always in order to receive a positive, his wages. The difference between a free worker and a slave can always be seen in this. A slave is someone who is kept at work against his will, by chains, whips, and guns, that is, by physical force applied by other people. In the absence of such things, he would run off. A free worker, on the other hand, is someone who works of his own choice, and who, more likely, can be kept from his work only by means of physical force. The worker in Galbraith's Calcutta jute mill, for example, is not kept there by the threat of being shot if he leaves, as in the case of a worker in a Soviet labor camp. On the contrary, from Galbraith's description, it is probable that it would take the threat of being shot to keep that worker away from his job. A worker is a slave not because he must choose to work as the means of eating, but when he chooses not to work and is compelled to do so nevertheless, by means of physical force. Of course, very few people can choose for very long not to work at all. But no matter how poor they are, they can always choose not to work for any particular employer whenever any other employer offers them better terms. This fact that while people must work in some capacity, they can choose in which particular capacity, Galbraith and the Marxists choose to ignore by focusing on the case of unemployment and the unavailability of alternative jobs. The existence of unemployment and the lack of alternative jobs is itself the consequence of violations of freedom and capitalism, specifically violations which keep money wage rates artificially high or which hold down the demand for labor. Yet even though mass unemployment exists, it does not prevent individuals from having alternative employment opportunities at some time or other in their lives, and the ability to choose among these alternatives is vital. Its importance to the individuals concerned is demonstrated by the fact that to deprive them of it, chains, whips, and guns are required. So much then for the attempt to portray capitalist employers as slave or serf owners on the basis of an equivocation between forced labor and the necessity of working imposed by the nature of reality. By the same token, it should also be realized that slave and serf owners, qua slave or serf owners, did not at all derive their incomes in the manner in which a businessman or capitalist derives his. They did not, for example, derive their incomes by virtue of owning land or capital, the means of production. They derived their incomes by means of the initiation of force, by extortion and theft. It is necessary to clear up this confusion, particularly in regard to feudal landowners, who, it is often assumed, held their position on the basis of their ownership of vast tracts of land. The feudal nobility were in fact not landowners at all in the modern sense of the term. Their position was more analogous to that of hereditary commanders of military bases. As I explained in Lecture 4, a feudal nobleman did not have the right to sell his alleged property, or to pledge it as security for debt, or to contract away its use on a long-term basis. For the theory of feudal landholdings was that the land was intended to serve an unbroken line of succeeding generations of noblemen. Each of these would use it in part to maintain himself and his family at a level dictated by custom, and for the rest to maintain vassals with whom he would appear at the side of the king or some other higher nobleman when called upon to do so. And the king himself was not to regard his domains as his private property serving his personal pleasure, but as serving the purposes of the state. The feudal nobleman both lacked essential rights of a private property owner and possessed powers that are absolutely no part of the rights of a private property owner. He was the local government. He combined in his person the powers of policeman, judge, and lawmaker. His workers were legally prohibited from leaving his estate. By the same token, no other nobleman was allowed to bid for the services of his workers, nor he for the services of their workers, nor, as I mentioned, could he dismiss workers born on his estate. Thus, a feudal nobleman did not earn his income in the manner of a landowner or capitalist who must compete for labor and who holds his position only by being able successfully to compete as a seller in the market for products as well. Rather, he derived his income in his capacity as a virtual slave owner and as a tax collector. Thus, every aspect of Marxism's attempt to confuse economic inequality under capitalism with economic inequality under earlier systems is false. The greater income and wealth of the businessman and capitalist is the result of positive productive contribution that increases the income and wealth of everyone else as well, while the greater income and wealth of the owner of slaves or serfs is based on force and is thus at the expense of the income and wealth of everyone else. Now let us consider economic inequality under socialism, which, despite the original promises of the Marxists, is very much in existence in every socialist country. In part, economic inequality under socialism exists because, as we saw in Lecture 2, the consequences of requiring economic equality are so disastrous that the system simply could not function if it were insisted upon. Thus, after a brief experiment with it that never actually applied to their leaders, even the Russian communists had to abandon it and to establish an extensive system of material incentives. However, despite the propaganda of the Marxists and the common impression, the basis for economic inequality under socialism actually goes far deeper than any such merely pragmatic concession would imply. Such concessions might explain why economic inequality is allowed to exist among various grades of workers and lower levels of government functionaries. But there is a much more fundamental basis for economic inequality under socialism, a radical economic inequality between the leadership of a socialist society and the great mass of its citizens. This is the fact that by the fundamental moral political principle of socialism, the citizens of a socialist society are necessarily means to the ends of its rulers. Of course, what they are openly described as is, quote, means to the ends of society, unquote. Yet society does not inhabit any known mountaintop, and does not have a telephone or post office box, or any other means by which it might be contacted and its ends made known directly. Society is a mere abstraction that has no actual existence. Thus, the determination of its presumed ends falls to the leadership of the socialist society. And in this way, the citizens, who are described as means to the ends of society, in fact become means to ends determined by the rulers of the socialist society, or simply means to the ends of the rulers. Can it be surprising that under such a profoundly servile arrangement, an arrangement that is in fact fundamentally indistinguishable from serfdom and slavery, the rulers live better than the ruled? Should one really be shocked to learn that in the Soviet Union and the other communist countries there is a, quote, new class, unquote, of high government officials and party members and their favorites, which shops at special stores from which the great mass of citizens are prohibited from entering, which has access to special clinics and hospitals and to special schools for its children, all of which are closed to others, and whose members are assigned automobiles, dachas, and villas, while the great mass of people are fortunate indeed if they have enough bread and potatoes to eat, a pair of shoes on their feet, and a separate room for their family. What else should one expect under such an arrangement? Not capitalism, but socialism is a continuation of the inequality of slavery and serfdom. This is true both in fact and on principle. This conclusion, I know, will not be convincing to those who somehow still think of socialism as some kind of extension of political democracy. In their view, socialism should mean more, not less power for the individual citizen. Those who expect this do not realize in the first place that it is precisely under capitalism that the so-called common man has economic power, based on the way he spends his money or chooses not to spend it. For it is this that determines which investments are profitable and which are unprofitable, and thus ultimately determines the industries and products in which businessmen and capitalists choose to invest or not to invest. This is a power, moreover, that everyone exercises every day, again and again under capitalism, with every penny that he spends or fails to spend. And it is an exercise of power that allows practically everyone to be satisfied. To get what he wants under capitalism, an individual does not have to belong to a majority political party or convince a majority to share his preferences. Individuals with all kinds of different preferences can be simultaneously satisfied under capitalism. All that is necessary is that the individuals concerned be in a position to make the meeting of their particular preferences profitable. Thus, under capitalism, there is no such thing as a majority automobile, or dress, or book. On the contrary, there are only vast numbers of minorities, all of whom are simultaneously satisfied with different products designed to suit their particular preferences. For the businessmen and capitalists produce for each separate market segment that promises to be profitable. Under socialism, on the other hand, the power of the citizen would at most be to periodically make just one decision, the selection of the official or the political party that was then to have the power to make all further decisions. It would be simply impossible for the citizens to decide by voting the countless questions of what kinds and quantities of each product should be produced, and by what methods and in which locations they should be produced. For not only would they have time for nothing else but voting, but they could never acquire the knowledge to make such decisions rationally. We are back to the problem I explained in Lecture 2, that if socialism were to be based on majority decisions, everyone would have to have detailed knowledge of all of production, which is contrary to the whole division of labor and is simply impossible. In reality, socialism not only does not mean any extension of political democracy, but is absolutely incompatible with political democracy as that term is usually understood, namely political freedom. For under socialism there can be no freedom of the press, since the government owns all the newspapers and publishing houses, and thus decides what can and cannot be printed. There can be no freedom of speech, since the government owns all the meeting halls, and as the sole employer can determine the life's fate of any critic. Thus, there should be no doubt that under socialism the individual is the means to the ends of the rulers, and that by inner necessity it is a system fully as iniquitous as slavery and serfdom. Even the economic incentives that exist under socialism thoroughly reflect its character as a society of status and servility. For the incentives it offers are all incentives in achieving the goals of the leadership, not the goals of the individual citizens. As I explain in The Government Against the Economy, the incentive system of socialism is analogous to the incentive system that exists in an army. In an army, there are incentives for privates to be promoted to corporal, and corporals to sergeant, and so on. But the purpose of that incentive system is to make the army more responsive to the wishes of its commander. It is certainly not to make life easier for the privates. Just so under socialism. The purpose of its incentive system is to make the lesser members of society more responsive to the wishes of the dictator or ruling elite in carrying out his or its objectives. Thus, a socialist society offers incentives to scientists to develop new and better weapons. It offers incentives to informers and secret police officials in order to maintain its power at home. It offers incentives to champion athletes and other star performers, such as outstanding dancers and chess players, whose success will bring prestige to it and its leaders. It offers incentives to managers, engineers, and skilled workers, without which all production would collapse and its power be broken. And it tries to offer incentives even to unskilled workers to produce more rather than less. But none of these incentives has as its purpose or effect the improvement of the life of the individual citizen, which is the purpose and effect of the incentive system of capitalism, where each man is acknowledged as an end in himself and is free to act accordingly. As I have shown, in socialist theory, the individual citizen is not the end, but the means, and in socialist practice, the individual citizen is utterly powerless economically. As I have already explained, there is no profit and loss incentive and no competition or freedom of competition under socialism. And so there is no reason for the officials in charge of production in a socialist state to be very much concerned about supplying the individual. They become concerned only if some disaster threatens, such as famine or revolution, which in turn would threaten their power. Then and only then they may try to improve the conditions of the average person for a while. In concluding this discussion, I have to note that the incentive system of socialism does not succeed in preventing forced labor. In Lecture 2, I pointed out that forced labor is implied under a system of economic equality. Forced labor exists under socialism even without economic equality. It exists on the basis of the ethical principles of socialism, and because the connection between work and reward is broken for a different reason than economic equality, namely by the existence of chronic shortages of consumers' goods and labor. I will not attempt to explain this connection here, however, but simply refer you to the Government Against the Economy. I want to summarize my critique of the Marxian doctrine on economic inequality, which attempts to portray economic inequality under capitalism as a continuation of economic inequality under slavery and serfdom, and which claims that socialism is required to end this exploitation of man by man. 1. Economic inequality under capitalism is based on positive, productive contribution, which operates to the benefit of all. Economic inequality under serfdom and slavery, on the other hand, was the result of force, of theft and extortion, and for this reason operated to the loss of others. 2. It is thoroughly illegitimate to attempt to depict capitalists as exploiters and wage earners as slaves on the basis of the fact that reality compels people to work in order to live, and for all practical purposes to work for capitalists. People do not work for a capitalist because he inflicts the pain of hunger on them, as Galbraith implies, but because he pays them wages. Slaves are compelled to work by force. The employees of a capitalist, on the other hand, can be kept from their work only by force. 3. It is an error to believe that the higher incomes of the feudal nobility were based on their ownership of land, or even to regard them as property owners in the first place. They lacked essential rights of ownership and possessed powers having nothing to do with ownership, namely the arbitrary powers of feudal government officials. 4. Despite the original promises of the Marxists, economic inequality exists under socialism. This is only partly explainable on the basis of pragmatic concessions to the requirements of survival. Radical economic inequality of a kind indistinguishable from that of slavery and serfdom follows from the fundamental moral political premise of socialism that the individual is a means to the ends of society. In reality, this necessarily makes him the means to the ends of the ruling elite. 5. In no sense does socialism represent an extension of the principles of political democracy, or more correctly, political freedom. Economic matters cannot be decided by majority voting, and what socialism actually accomplishes is the destruction of the real economic power of the so-called common man, which is based on his freedom to spend his own income as he wishes under capitalism. Socialism also destroys the freedom of press and the freedom of speech in giving the government the ownership of all newspapers, publishing houses, and meeting halls, and in making the government the sole employer. 6. The economic incentives that socialism offers fully reflect its character as a society of status and servitude, for they are all designed to promote the ends of the rulers, not those of the individual citizens, as under capitalism. 7. The existence of economic inequality under socialism does not rescue it from the need for forced labor, which continues to exist because of shortages of labor and consumers' goods, as I explain in The Government Against the Economy. To sum up this summary, virtually every evil that the socialists allege of capitalism on the score of economic inequality is true of socialism. By the same token, the end of exploitation and the achievement for the first time in history of a society based on the peaceful, harmonious cooperation of all men, which they allege will come with the arrival of socialism, has already come, to the extent of the arrival and continued existence of capitalism. Now, the advocates of economic equality have a fallback position, which they also frequently use as a camouflage, and that is the doctrine of equality of opportunity. They are not, they say, advocating anything so foolish or so extreme as the imposition of actual economic equality. All that they are advocating, they say, is that everyone have an equal chance, that, as they put it, all the runners begin the race from the same starting line. On this basis, they feel free to advocate the confiscation of inheritances, public education through the postgraduate level, and laws preventing private discrimination on the basis not only of such factors as race, religion, or national origin, but also age, medical condition, and physical handicap. The supporters of the equality of opportunity doctrine view opportunities as fundamentally external to the individual, in effect as various dishes carried by waiters on trays, which under capitalism are arbitrarily served to some and withheld from others. They want the government to seize control, they say, not of the distribution of wealth and income, but merely of the distribution of these dishes, as it were, that is, of the opportunities to earn wealth and income, and so give everyone an equal chance. To most people, this doctrine sounds eminently fair and reasonable, but, in fact, it is even more against the nature of reality than is the straight-out doctrine of equality of wealth and income. This becomes clear as soon as we look beyond the inheritance of wealth and begin to consider other external factors that affect the opportunities an individual has. For example, consider such factors as the intelligence of a child's parents, their education and vocabulary, their system of values, and their love for him and treatment of him, not to mention their level of income and the kind of material life they lead and thereby expose him to while he is growing up. Differences in these factors confront a child with differences in opportunities that are certainly of no less significance for his future life, including his ability to earn wealth and income, than those which are based on the wealth he may or may not inherit. To create equality of opportunity with respect to these factors, nothing less would be necessary than to abolish the institution of the family and to raise all children in government orphanages, where they could all be brought up in exactly the same way. This, of course, was the idea of Plato, and it was supported by many socialists in the 19th century and earlier in this century. But even this would not be enough to achieve equality of opportunity. For consider, even if all of these environmental factors could be made the same, there would still remain enormous differences in the intellectual and physical endowment of the child himself, based on his genetic inheritance. A highly intelligent, strong, and beautiful child, for example, automatically has enormous advantages over a stupid, weak, and ugly child that is given the same upbringing. How can such different children and the adults they later become be given equality of opportunity? One possible answer is that the government should concentrate more heavily on the upbringing of the less fortunate, thus perhaps raising their intelligence, improving their strength, and maybe even their looks. But no amount of such extra effort by the government can significantly make up for what nature has denied. Another possible answer is that the government should insist that such differences simply be disregarded. The first answer manifests itself today in heavy government support for special programs for the education of the retarded. The second in those anti-discrimination laws, such as California's, which prohibit discrimination in employment based on medical condition or physical handicap. The only other possible answers I can see are that, failing the government's ability to create equality of opportunity by raising up the less fortunate, it should tear down the more fortunate. If it cannot make the stupid intelligent, the weak strong, and the ugly beautiful, It can find a way to hamper or destroy intelligence, strength, and beauty, and so achieve equality of opportunity by making everyone stupid, weak, and ugly. Frankly, I do not know of anyone who openly advocates this policy, though I would not be surprised if it did have advocates, for it follows logically from the goal of equality of opportunity. Oh yes, there is a fourth solution. The government could attempt to determine the genetic endowment of children. It could enact a program of eugenics, an attempt to breed children who would all possess the same characteristics at birth. Then, with the same upbringing, the demand for equality of opportunity could apparently at last be satisfied. These absurd and vicious implications of the equality of opportunity doctrine should make one begin to wonder what kind of ideal equality of opportunity really is. In reality, it is not a legitimate ideal at all. It appears to represent justice only on the basis of a thoroughly confused view of the nature of opportunities and the causes of human success. Let us consider what opportunities actually are, and then establish some important facts about them. An opportunity is merely an occasion on which successful action is possible. It is a situation that an individual can take advantage of to his gain. What needs to be realized about opportunities is, first of all, that there is no intrinsic scarcity of them. They arise again and again. The second thing that needs to be understood is that what is important in connection with them and deserves to be fought for, as a matter both of justice and universal self-interest, is not that vicious absurdity, the equality of opportunity, but the freedom of opportunity. I will explain what the freedom of opportunity means and why it is so important in just a moment. Finally, what needs to be understood about opportunities is that they can be, and regularly are, created by individuals. Yes, opportunities are themselves products of human thought and action. Just how they are is something I will also explain in a few moments. Let us consider the abundance of opportunities. An opportunity exists every time there is the possibility of improving oneself in any way. If one is penniless and there is an unfilled job available that one has the ability to fill, one has the opportunity of ending one's pennilessness. If one has a job and there is any better job available that one has the ability to fill, one has the opportunity to improve one's position further. If there is any skill that one doesn't possess but is capable of learning, then one has the opportunity of expanding one's skills. In fact, in the nature of the case, the economic opportunities potentially open to the individual far exceed his ability to exploit them, with the result that he must choose among them, selecting some and rejecting others. This follows from the fact that there is always room for improvement in the satisfaction of man's wants, and that the basis for carrying out such improvement is the performance either of more labor or of more productive labor. In other words, built into the fact that man's wants can always be satisfied more fully or better is the opportunity for the performance of more labor as the means of satisfying them more fully or better, and the opportunity of improving the productivity of his labor. Yes, what I am saying is that in the nature of things, there are potentially limitless opportunities both for increasing employment and for raising the productivity of labor. For there are virtually limitless possibilities for improvement in the satisfaction of man's wants. Indeed, the potential opportunities for employment always dwarf man's ability actually to work, which is one of the major reasons that he must be concerned with raising the productivity of his labor, that is, the output of goods per unit of labor expended. A good measure of the excess of potential employment opportunities over the ability actually to work is provided by the excess of income that practically everyone would like to be able to spend over the income he is actually capable of earning at his current rate of pay. If, for example, the average person is easily capable of thinking of desirable ways in which he might spend $100,000 per year, while he is actually able to earn, say, only $20,000 per year while working a 40-hour week, then roughly speaking, this is an indication that there is 5 times more labor out there waiting to be performed than people are presently performing. For the goods that they would each want to buy for $100,000 would require roughly 5 times more labor in their production than the goods they presently buy for $20,000. Their real problem is that with their current ability to produce and at their current rate of pay, they would have to work more hours than there are in the week in order to produce these goods and earn the income necessary to buy them. Their only hope of being able to obtain any significant part of the additional goods they would like is an increase in the productivity of their labor. That would give them more goods with the same or a shorter work week, and by reducing the production cost and price of those goods, enable their incomes to buy a larger quantity of them. Now, if you are wondering how it can be true that there are virtually limitless employment opportunities, and yet at the same time the world in which we live is characterized by chronic mass unemployment, and the experience of millions is that they have no opportunity for work, let me say that there is a very simple reconciliation. It is this: misguided laws and social institutions deny man the freedom of exploiting the opportunities for employment that the nature of reality offers him, and so force unemployment upon him. The problem of unemployment is the result of the violation of the freedom of opportunity, the violation of man's freedom to exploit the opportunities that reality offers him. The freedom of opportunity means, to be precise, the ability to exploit the opportunities afforded by reality without being stopped by the initiation of force. People are unable to find work, not because there is no work for them to do in reality, but because government interference, based on the initiation of physical force, prices their labor beyond the reach of potential employers. This interference is, specifically, the inflation of the money supply coupled with so-called pro-labor legislation. The inflation of the money supply first entices business firms into a state of illiquidity, a state in which, in the feverish expectation of taking in more and more money, they lend or invest too heavily and leave themselves with dangerously low levels of cash in relation to the bloated volume of financial activity they are carrying on. Then, as soon as the inflation is stopped or significantly slowed, they need to rebuild their cash holdings. They cut back their spending and lending, and a financial contraction ensues. The resulting fall in wage payments and sales revenues of all kinds leads to widespread business insolvencies and bankruptcies, which causes bank failures and possibly as a further result an actual decline in the quantity of money, which causes still further reductions in spending and an intensification of the depression. In an environment of financial contraction, government efforts to maintain or increase wage rates through such measures as minimum wage laws, pro-union legislation, or other forms of pressure on businessmen to maintain or increase wages necessarily result in mass unemployment. For the government's action deranges the relationship between the ability of business firms to spend for labor on the one side and wage rates on the other. It is not possible to have full employment when the government causes a cut in payroll spending and yet insists that each worker receive as much pay as before. Reduced payrolls could employ as many workers as larger payrolls, but only at correspondingly lower wages per unit of labor. This last is precisely what labor legislation and similar interference prevent. Thus, unemployment and the lack of employment opportunity is not the result of any fundamental or metaphysical lack of employment opportunity, but of the government's violation of the freedom of opportunity with respect to employment. First, the government creates the boom-bust cycle, and then, when the bust comes, it prohibits businessmen and wage earners from offering and accepting the wage rates that would enable them sufficiently to exploit the limitless employment opportunities that reality offers to the point of establishing full employment. Although time does not permit me to go into the matter, I must state that the violation of the freedom of opportunity is also what underlies the problems described under the head of racial discrimination. Their solution, too, would follow from the establishment of freedom of opportunity. For proof, see my article, Capitalism, the Cure for Racism, in The Intellectual Activist. I must interject that this article is now available as a pamphlet from the Jefferson School. Now, I've said that opportunities are themselves products. I want to explain what I mean by this. In any given instance, an opportunity is the result of a combination of external circumstances and the skills and abilities an individual possesses, such that he is able to exploit the circumstances to his advantage. An opportunity is a product in the sense that the skills and abilities an individual possesses are the result of his successful exploitation of previous, lesser opportunities. Please observe that opportunities are never a matter merely of external circumstances that are served up on a plate, as it were. They always depend on what the individual himself brings to the external circumstances in the way of skills and abilities. These skills and abilities, in turn, are never the automatic result of the individual's genetic inheritance. They are the cumulative product of what the individual has done with his life up to that point. They reflect his initial choices to use his genetic inheritance to deal with external circumstances in ways that developed certain skills and abilities, and then further choices to use those skills and abilities to deal with further external circumstances in ways that developed also further skills and abilities, and so on up to the present moment. For example, a child who chooses to use his mind to learn arithmetic thereby creates an indispensable precondition for the potential opportunity to learn algebra. Unless and until he learns arithmetic, there can be no possibility of any opportunity for him to learn algebra. If he does learn arithmetic, and then when he is confronted with the opportunity of learning algebra, successfully exploits it too, he creates a necessary internal basis for the further opportunity of learning calculus, and so on. It is similar with regard to employment. The individual who exploits the opportunity to become a worker in a factory thereby creates a possible basis for his later on becoming a foreman there. If he becomes a foreman, he creates a possible basis for later promotion to a managerial position, and so on. Of course, he will have to expand his abilities in each of these jobs, and maybe acquire other skills off the job as well, perhaps by going to night school, for example. But the point is that opportunity presents itself as the rungs of a ladder. Each rung is open only to those who have climbed within reach by ascending the previous rungs. If we view things in this light, the notion of the advocates of equality of opportunity, that opportunities are a matter of environmental circumstances, or environmental circumstances combined with genetic inheritance, appears absurdly inadequate. It is actually ludicrous to think that what a person does is the outcome merely of his environment and genes. In between the environment and the genes are a lifetime of choices, each of which has a vital bearing on the individual's ability to deal with his environment and to make further choices. In between the environment and the genes is the whole life of the person as a being who functions on a level above that of an automaton. It is not necessary that people make the choices that develop their skills and abilities at any precise moment. There is considerable leeway, and it is never completely too late to start. For example, someone can learn to read even in old age, and then begin rapidly to build on that foundation. In a free society, with its abundance of opportunities, with no fixed deadlines on the process of developing one's skills to better exploit them, all talk of inequality of opportunity must be judged as just so much whining and excuse-making. In such a society, everyone, whatever his starting point in life, is able to raise himself very far if that is what he chooses to do. He can miss many, many opportunities, and still there will be more. He can begin improving his ability to exploit them at any time, and start moving up from that moment. It is true that in such a society, if two individuals were born equal in every respect, except that one had richer parents than the other, and if they both chose to actively and constantly develop their skills and abilities from birth on, the one with the richer parents would probably always be ahead of the one with the poorer parents. But far from representing any kind of embarrassment to a free society, it is perfectly just that things be this way. The advantages of the individual with the richer parents would not prevent the one with the poorer parents from rising, and rising not only very high, but without any fixed limit. It is simply the case that wealth is beneficial, and if everything else is in fact the same, it makes a difference. But what else is wealth for if not to provide benefits? And more fundamentally, what are parents for if not to provide every possible benefit to their children? One of the ugliest consequences of the equality of opportunity doctrine is that it actually causes some parents deliberately to do less for their children on the grounds that other parents are unable to do as much, and thereby willfully to default on their responsibilities as parents. Furthermore, as I explained in my discussion of the institution of inheritance, everyone, non-heirs as well as heirs, benefits from the capital that is accumulated in order to be passed on to heirs. The non-heir is thus able to achieve more than he would have in the absence of the institution of inheritance, even if that is less than what someone else can achieve, who is both equally capable in every respect and has the benefit of an inheritance. The way this principle applies in the present instance is not only that the non-heir has the benefit of a more abundant supply of products and a greater demand for his labor by virtue of the existence of capital accumulated because of the institution of inheritance, but also that he can benefit in his potential capacity as a businessman and capitalist himself. In our example of the two boys who grow up with equal ability, while one has the advantage of money, that advantage can enable the one without the money to make his own fortune, even if it is a smaller fortune than the one who begins with the money. For example, suppose the two of them become partners in business. If neither of them had capital, both would be equal partners because they are equally talented. But neither of them would be able to get very far, or at least not nearly as soon, because of their lack of capital. If one of them has the necessary capital to contribute to their business, he will have more than a 50% share in their partnership. But the one with a smaller share will also be better off now. He will have, say, 40% or 30% of a business that now earns 2, 3, or 5 times more profits because of the capital contributed to it. He must have more than he would otherwise have had, or he will not enter into the partnership. Now, of course, the real fact is that individuals are not born perfectly equal in all respects but the wealth of their parents, and they do not make the same choices in connection with developing their skills and abilities. Time and again, there are individuals born to poorer parents, to parents badly deficient not only in wealth, but in education, knowledge, and even character. Individuals whose own endowment at birth or in childhood is not only not exceptional, but possibly deficient in some important respects. Yet over the course of their lives, these individuals manage to far outstrip in their accomplishments practically everyone else, despite their having begun under such seemingly insuperable disadvantages. How do they do it? The way they do it is by making the choice and the effort to exploit as far as they can whatever opportunities present themselves for self-improvement. Once they begin to do this, they actually do begin to improve themselves. And now, when they face the world, they are better equipped than before. And because they are better equipped, there are more opportunities for self-improvement open to them than there were before. They seize these further opportunities, thereby further improving themselves and their subsequent ability to act and seize opportunities, and so on year after year. What happens is that these individuals engage in a personal internal process very similar to capital formation in the economy of a country. They use the means at their disposal to build the personal attributes, intellectual, psychological, characterological, and physical, required for further success. And then they use the personal attributes they have constructed thus far to further construct such attributes. It is similar in principle to the process of a farmer scrimping and straining to obtain an additional supply of seed, of then using the larger supply of seed to produce a bigger crop the following year, from which a much greater supply of seed can be obtained for the year after that, and so on. Or to the economy of a whole country working very hard and saving very heavily to be able to make iron and steel available for the construction of the first railroads and steel mills, and then, with the aid of these first railroads and steel mills, being able to produce more of practically everything, including more and better railroads and steel mills. Concentration on building up the means of further action, whether internal and personal or external and material, produces exponentially increasing results, because each success serves to increase the capabilities for further action, which makes possible still greater success. Those who concentrate heavily on these efforts rapidly improve, while those who neglect them stagnate or decline. It is on these principles, I think, that one can understand both such things as how Japan, so poor and backward a generation or two ago, can now be within sight of economically overtaking the United States, and how again and again, in a free society, poor boys grow up to become rich and famous men. The secret of the success of the poor boys is contained in that old but very accurate expression that we so seldom hear today: the self-made man. Those poor boys build themselves into the kind of men capable of achieving great success. Allow me to interject that I speak of boys and men out of a consideration of custom and history. Actually, of course, the same principles apply to girls and women. There are self-made women as well as men. A following example, perhaps, can help us to understand how, by building themselves into the right kind of men, they outstrip even those with the greatest advantages at birth. Imagine two boys, one the newborn son of a highly educated millionaire, the other the newborn son of a poor, uneducated coal miner. To most people, it seems that the millionaire's son has such great advantages that he can never be overtaken. But this is not so, and the reason why not can be seen in terms of a few conceptual snapshots, as it were, of the two boys at different stages of their development. Thus, at birth, neither of them is capable of very much of anything. All of their capabilities remain to be developed. The millionaire's son is not capable of jumping out of his crib and using his father's millions to make more millions. If he is ever to have that ability, he will first have to develop it. By age 6 or 7, say, the two boys have developed certain attitudes toward acquiring knowledge, and other important attributes too, of course. But for simplicity's sake, we will focus just on this aspect and its possible ramifications. If the poorer boy recognizes the value of knowledge and the necessity of making his best effort to acquire it, while the richer boy does not, the poorer boy has gained an advantage that can become of growing significance over the years. By age 14 or 15, perhaps, the poorer boy has acquired an important body of knowledge that the richer boy has not. He understands algebra, trigonometry, and something of physics and chemistry. The richer boy has no real understanding of these subjects. By age 20 or 22, the poorer boy is capable of working as an engineer, say, and making a significant contribution to the profits of anyone who employs him. The richer boy, on the other hand, can only be employed either in a menial capacity or at the expense of his father, who must continue to support him under the guise of paying him a salary, or who must provide for some associate to pay a fictitious salary and compensate that associate in some form. By age 30, if he is really talented, the poorer boy has developed some significant ideas which have earned him some significant sums of money and have enabled him to start his own business. He now possesses a capacity for earning money which exceeds the richer boy's. The richer boy may still have vastly more money and earn a larger absolute amount, but the poorer boy is in a position to earn it now at a much faster rate. For the poorer boy's money is under his own intelligent control and can earn a high rate of profit. The richer boy's money is either in his own incompetent hands, in which case he can rapidly lose it, or it is in the hands of others who are more competent, but who pay him only a relatively modest rate of interest or dividends. As the years go by, with the poorer boy earning a 50, 75, or 100% annual rate of profit and plowing back almost all of it, while the richer boy earns a 3, 4, or 5% rate of interest or dividends and consumes almost all of it, the poorer boy becomes the richer man. This, in briefest essence, is how it actually happens that in a free society, penniless newcomers are able to overtake and surpass even those with the greatest inherited wealth. It cannot be stressed too strongly in this connection how critical is the element of freedom of opportunity. In order to succeed, the poorer boys must have the freedom to earn the highest rates of profit they can and to keep those profits. They must also be free of government controls and regulations, which can easily prevent them from ever getting started, by placing innumerable bureaucratic obstacles in their way, such as causing unnecessary delays, requiring unnecessary staffs of lawyers, accountants, and clerks that they are unable to afford, and by diverting their valuable time and efforts from serious work to contending with the arbitrary power and sheltered stupidity of government officials. Now, it is also true that the success of the poorer boys depends on their being able to obtain education. But this certainly does not mean that a case is made for public education or compulsory tax-supported education of any kind. The kind of men and boys I have been describing grasp very early the value of acquiring knowledge and make it their business to find opportunities for acquiring it. Public education, on the other hand, by removing all incentives of profit and loss and all possibility of genuine competition in education, and by thus sheltering inefficiency and incompetence while making improvement almost impossible, creates a system of instruction so poor that compulsion is the only means of keeping most of the students in attendance. And because people, including children, are not automatons programmed by a combination of genes and their environment, the system of forcing books and lectures on unwilling minds just doesn't work. For the kind of men and boys I have been describing, public education is unnecessary. What is necessary, or more correctly would be extremely helpful to them, and would be far more efficient and effective for everyone, is the freedom of education, combined with the availability of private, voluntarily supported merit scholarships, and also the freedom of working and earning money to pay for education. We do not generally realize the extent to which the present system of public education destroys the freedom of opportunity with respect to education. By making educational innovations virtually impossible through government controls on curricula, faculty qualifications, and teaching methods, and requiring that competition take place against a subsidized competitor who does not charge, countless educational innovations that might have been made have not been made. People have been prohibited or prevented from exploiting the opportunities they perceive for improvement in education. The further opportunities that those improvements would have constituted for students have thus been prevented from coming into being. We have a situation today where the law both prevents better, more economical forms of education from being offered, and prevents students from earning the means of paying for education, by making it almost impossible for anyone under the age of 18 to obtain any kind of meaningful job. Our present system is one of almost systematic opposition to the freedom of opportunity with respect both to education and to the subsequent achievement of prosperity. On an increasing scale, it prevents people from exploiting the opportunities open to them, and thereby prevents the creation of further opportunities that would be available not only to them, but to those with whom they dealt. In preventing the development of a better, more efficient educational system, it prevents the opportunities that such a system would have afforded to students from coming into existence. In preventing the acquisition of fortunes, it prevents the opportunities that those fortunes would have afforded to workers and suppliers in the form of a demand for labor and capital goods, and to customers in the form of the products produced. These last observations, incidentally, bring out a further important principle pertaining to opportunities that is consistent with our wider previous discussion of economic inequality under capitalism and with the synergistic nature of a division of labor society. Namely, each person's successful exploitation of the opportunities open to him creates further opportunities not only for himself, but for those with whom he deals. In other words, with respect to opportunities too, one man's gain is the gain of others. The losses caused by the violation of freedom of opportunity represent losses to everyone. The time is late, and I must bring this discussion to a close. What I have tried to show is that the notion of equality of opportunity, however innocent it may sound at first, is actually vicious and absurd. In its logically consistent form, it implies the destruction of the institution of the family, the implementation of a governmental program of eugenics, and the elimination or destruction of every personal attribute that represents an advantage of one person over others. In a positive vein, I have tried to show that what is actually important in connection with opportunities is the establishment of a free society and its corollary, the freedom of opportunity. In such a society, man is free to exploit the virtually limitless opportunities offered by the combination of his nature and the nature of the world. He must pick and choose among them, and he progressively creates better and better opportunities for himself by successfully exploiting the best of the opportunities available to him at any given time. In such a society, the notion of equality of opportunity reveals itself as absurdly irrelevant, as nothing more than an excuse for not taking advantage of the opportunities one has and for not creating better ones. In such a society, everyone can rise, no matter what his starting point or present position, and again people of the most humble origins overtake and surpass those who began with seemingly insuperable advantages. What is required for everyone to be able to succeed and at the same time represents full justice is not equality of opportunity, but freedom of opportunity. The successful exploitation of opportunities that freedom makes possible is the basis of each individual's being able to rise and create better opportunities, not only for himself, but for those with whom he deals as well. Thank you. Tomorrow, our subject will be economic competition.